Thank you, Julian, for that introduction, and thank you as always for organizing this conference. There's always very interesting and diverse ideas that are explored up here. And so in previous years, I've talked about religious literacy, I've talked about the Socratic approach to knowledge, and this year I'm going to turn to a topic that is maybe a little bit more sensitive, and that's the topic of death and the topic of grief. And so in order to go into this topic, I want to present a few things that are going to prepare us, a few conceptual guidelines and markers that will help us. But before we prepare, I also wanted to say something so that we can prepare for that preparing. And that's a little anecdote that comes out of the time of the Buddha. And so the Buddha was known for tailoring his message, his teaching, to whoever was asking him so that they would understand in the way that they were capable of. And so there was a woman who had lost her child, whose child had died, and she was distraught. And she had heard that the Buddha was enlightened, that he had special powers, and she went to the Buddha and said, "Can you please bring my child back to life?" And the Buddha said, "Sure, I can do that. But in order to do so, you will need to collect one mustard seed from a household that has not experienced death." And the woman was very excited at that prospect. Here's somebody who can help me out. And so she went out very diligently. She knocked on the first door. "Do you have a mustard seed?" "Yes." "Have you experienced death?" "Well, of course." And she went to the next house, same answer. The next house, same answer, until eventually she understood what the Buddha was trying to show her, which is that actually death and grieving is a universal human experience. So please keep that in mind as I'm about to go into the preparing for my talk, that whatever I'm speaking about up here today is personal to me and my own journey, but really each and every single one of us in this room is going to encounter this or similar situations in the future. So now that we've prepared the preparing, we can prepare. So two big ideas that I want to just put out here and keep these in the back of your mind as we're moving through this story. I want to talk about how suffering is approached in the different schools of Buddhism. And so the metaphor that we can use is actually a tree that produces poisonous fruits. So the poisonous fruits are comparable to the suffering that we undergo in our life. Emotional pain, physical pain, dissatisfaction, etc. And so if you follow the Hinayana school of Buddhism, and unfortunately I don't have time to really go into talking about the differences between all of these, then the approach to that tree is let's put a fence up around it so that we don't get too close, so that we don't participate in behaviors that will bring out more of those fruits. So there are 5 ethical precepts that every lay Buddhist follows, which include refraining from stealing, lying, killing, intoxication, and sexual misconduct. And so these are like the 5 pillars of the fence around the tree. And if we put that fence up, then we're not going to get too close, and we're going to minimize the suffering that inevitably follows from those actions. And I think if you reflect on it yourself, you'll see that those 5 things will bring suffering in one way or another. And these are actually fairly universal ethical guidelines too. You don't have to be Buddhist to buy into these. These are found also in Christianity and Islam. Then in the Mahayana approach, the Mahayana school of Buddhism, they say, good, build the fence, but we also need to find a way to get at the roots of the tree that's producing this poison. So you can do what you can to keep away from the actions that are going to create suffering. And while you're doing that, try to practice things like patience, generosity, compassion, that are going to work with your mind on a deeper level so that it'll make you less likely to even want to do those things. So it's kind of like at first, like when a parent has to teach a lesson to a child, the rules have to stick. And then at some point in the future, the child might realize, wait a minute, there's good reason behind that. You come to understand why those interdictions were in place. And so the goal really is the transformation of the mind here, and so that the desire to participate in those behaviors will diminish. In the Vajrayana approach, they say, good, keep doing both of those things, but we know that despite our best efforts to keep ourselves away from that tree and to work with our minds so that we don't generate more suffering, there is going to be poisonous fruit that tree is going to produce. So given that, maybe we can look at that poisonous fruit and try to transform it into something medicinal, or to try to transform it into something helpful. And this is actually the basis of many medicines, many common medicines that we take all the time without realizing it. Aspirin, for example, is a poisonous bark of a tree. But if it's given in the right dose and in the right context, then it becomes a medicine. And so the metaphor here is that when the suffering of strong emotions or life situations like death, when that arises, we can work directly with those. If we can't heed them off, if we can't keep them at bay, then at least when they come our way, maybe we can work with them and try to get something out of them. And so the Vajrayana really sees every life experience, afflictive emotions, grief, tragedy, pain, death, as gateways to awakening. And actually, when we get hung up and we become neurotic and we participate in certain patterns that perpetuate our suffering, the Vajrayana will actually say that that neurotic pattern contains wisdom within it. It is wisdom. It's just gotten solidified into a form that can become kind of dangerous. So kind of like how water transforms into ice, and the ice can be very sharp and it can become a weapon, but if you put light on ice, it melts into water, into life-giving water. And similarly, if you put light on neurotic tendencies, on difficult situations, then the energy of wisdom can be liberated there. So this is one conceptual framework to keep in mind. The other one that I'm going to really be calling on is Aristotle. So Aristotle was the student of Plato, who was the student of Socrates, for those of you in my class. And Aristotle was one of the first people to systematically try to understand what human beings are doing when we are writing stories. In particular, he was interested in dramatic stories. And so he wrote a book called The Poetics, which is still a foundation of understanding drama nowadays. And I studied this text when I was doing my master's in history at McGill, and there are some very interesting observations that Aristotle makes, namely that whenever a human being is constructing a story, irrespective of whether those events in the story actually happened, he or she is a writer of fiction. So even if you're talking about what happened to you this morning or what happened in Canadian history in 1950, you're speaking fiction. And the reason for that is that whenever you're telling a story, you necessarily have to decide what is relevant and what is irrelevant. So you tell me about your morning, and you're already making decisions about what to include. You can't possibly tell me about your entire morning, so you're going to focus on particular elements. You're probably leaving a lot out. Maybe you have a bias for why you're leaving some things out. So you make the events. You become the maker of those events when you narrate about them. And it doesn't matter whether it's a work of fiction or whether you're talking about something that actually happened. So on the one hand, especially for the historical profession, this is a little bit disconcerting to be told that, wait a minute, here I thought I was working with stuff that was real, with stuff that actually happened. You're telling me that when I write a work of history, I'm employing fictive techniques? Aristotle is saying yes here. He's saying that you are weaving that narrative according to your perspective. And so for the academic historian, that might be disconcerting. But for me, when I really understand and internalize that, it's very liberating. It makes me realize that actually we are free at any point to re-narrate the story of ourselves. Most of the time we're unconsciously narrating a story of who I am and how I got to be where I am. And it can seem like, well, there's some things that are just can't be changed in that, birth and this event, but we can change the way that we relate to them. we can change the way that we narrate the meaning around those events. And so that's very powerful for me. So I'm going to talk about how I've been doing that here in this experience. Okay, so now that we're prepared, let's go into the darkness. Let's become enveloped by chaos. Whenever you are reading a story about a character who journeys to the underworld or who suddenly everything falls apart, well, this is a metaphor for what happens to us when there are life situations that overwhelm us and are out of our control. And so where do I begin this story? I could say that it kind of began with the Big Bang. And that wouldn't be an incorrect beginning. It could begin with my birth. It could begin with when I came to Montreal. It could begin with when I met my wife on a beach in India 10 years ago. And all of those would be perfectly acceptable beginnings. But for my purposes, for the story that I want to tell you, I'm going to choose to start this on a gloomy January day in 2016, when my wife was 5 months pregnant with our second child. And so we went to St. Luc Hospital and we did the 20-week ultrasound, the morphological ultrasound that showed that we were having a daughter, and I was overjoyed at that. And all of her limbs were there, and everything was checking out. And the technician had just a little bit of a doubt about something that she saw around the heart. And she suggested that we follow this up with a cardiac ultrasound. And so we made an appointment, and we went to Saint-Justine, and there they had a special machine that goes and only focuses on the heart. And we were called into the cardiologist's office afterwards, and we were informed that our daughter had a very rare condition called pulmonary atresia. It affects about 1 in 20,000 births. And what's happening in pulmonary atresia is one of the valves that shuttles oxygen-depleted blood through the heart into the lungs was blocked completely. And so what would happen if she were born is that she would die almost very, very soon, within a couple hours. She would basically suffocate to death. She would turn blue. And there's many babies in the world in places that don't have ultrasound where this happens, and your baby just dies like that, and you really don't have any idea why or what's going on there. She said that there were a few interventions, though, that could be possible. So she could be born, and then they would send a catheter in through a vein to try to pop a hole in the valve, which would sort of be a provisional surgery till when she was a little bit older and she could have more corrective surgeries. But nothing was really certain here. Even with the intervention at birth, there was still a 1/3 chance that she would die right then. And there was still 1/3 chance that she wouldn't make it to her 5th birthday, despite all the interventions, even if they were successful. And on top of that, there was no way of knowing whether some of these problems in her heart might also contribute to other problems, cognitive deficiencies or other heart issues. And so there was a lot of unknown, and obviously this was a very shocking time for my wife and I, and we felt like we were just kind of hit over the head with a sledgehammer, and we had no idea really how to process this. So we faced a choice. We could either continue with the pregnancy and go through the rounds of interventions, understanding also that we had another small child who is around, and all these countless trips to the hospital would probably take a toll on him as well. Or we could choose to end the pregnancy right now. And if we did that, then she was going to have to give birth because it was at such an advanced stage. So what to do? We meditated. And every night I would put my hand on her belly and we would sit quietly together and we would see whatever was coming up in our hearts and in our minds. Maybe if we could try to feel something about the baby, if we could feel what she wanted. And very quickly, within the first couple of nights, there was an image that kept coming back to me. And I started meditating on it, and it became very important in this journey. And that is the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. So if you know this story, Abraham and Sarah had Isaac very late in their lives when Sarah was 90 years old. He was completely unexpected, and he was very precious to both of them. He was the guarantee for the covenant that God had made with Abraham to make his descendants as numerous as the stars. And then one day, maybe when Isaac is around your age, teenager, Abraham hears God telling him to go up to Mount Moriah, in where it's now Jerusalem, and sacrifice his son. And they undertake this multi-day journey, and Abraham brings Isaac to the rock and is about to bring down the knife on Isaac's throat. And then there's an angel who intervenes and takes the knife out of Abraham's hands and reveals that this was actually just a test that God had put in Abraham's path. It's kind of noteworthy, actually, that Abraham doesn't talk to God at all after this. He goes on and he remarries another woman, and we don't hear from him at all in the biblical narrative. So that should give some kind of indication about how traumatic such an event was for him. So I studied this story in greater detail, and I came to observe that there was a word that came back at three really important junctures in this story, and that was hineni, which can be translated as here I am, or I'm here. So God calls out to Abraham, where are you? And Abraham responds, here I am, hineni. And this happens two other important times. And I thought, okay, well, just like Abraham, I'm being called on a journey, and I don't know what the destination is. Just like Abraham, I might be forced to give up something that's very dear and very precious to me. And the way that Abraham responded to this call was by asserting that here he is. I'm going to show up for my life. I'm going to be present for whatever God is asking me in this situation. And so this became very important because you may not realize it, or at least I didn't, we have so many tools at our disposal to not be present with our life experience. And some of these are fairly obvious things, like intoxicants, smoking or drinking. This is a way of running away from some uncomfortable physical state, some uncomfortable emotions. But there are other ways that we probably all participate in, like compulsively checking our phones. I'm guilty as charged here. Whenever there's like a little dull moment and there's a little boredom or something like that, well then I check my Gmail for the 30th time that day. And that's actually a way of checking out from your experience. That's actually a way of not being present with what is arising in your life right then. And there are countless other ways. Getting involved in following sports or going to the movies. There's really countless distractions in our society. So I was observing that. I was observing myself, and I said, you know what? Maybe the only thing that I know right now is that I want to resolve to be present with my experience, just as it is. And one of the places that resolution brought me to was into my heart and into thinking, okay, well, what is going to be the basis of my decision right now? What are going to be my ethical guidelines? And I should just pause for a second to say, this is why your humanities ethics class is super important. Because when you find yourself in a situation like this, it's not the time to be looking into textbooks and into saying, okay, well, the utilitarians say this and Kant says this, and to be working through all those issues. It's too intense when you're in there. So when you go into your ethics class, it's a little bit like going to a gym or something. You're pumping yourself up, you're preparing, so that when you go out into your life, that's the competition, so that you're trained and you're ready. And I teach ethics. I revisit it all the time. And so, in a way, it was kind of funny to me that I was being faced with a very, very difficult ethical situation. And the answer was not at all clear for me what we should do. So I stayed with my experience, and I realized actually there are two guiding precepts or two guiding principles that I wanted to keep in mind with my wife in whatever decision that we were going to make. The first was going to be to try to minimize suffering in as much as we could for everybody involved. That seemed to be of paramount importance, that we wanted to create a situation where the fewest amount of beings would suffer as a result. The second was to be as loving and to do anything that we did with the intention of love in that. So I just wanted to take a moment here for you to put yourself in this position, knowing what I told you, and ask yourself, if I were in this situation, what would I do and why? And whatever you decide for yourself right now, that is the right decision for you. I'm not here to say that what we decided is the way that everybody should decide in this situation, because based on those two previous guidelines that I just shared, you could actually go either way on this one. You could say, I want to minimize suffering, so I'm going to obviously not kill my daughter. That would obviously be a great suffering for her. So I want to bring her into life, right? And I'm going to do that out of love. There are certainly many people who make that decision. But then there's also the other side that says, well, if she is existing, it would be in a body that's very challenged and handicapped, and she might undergo suffering only to die a little bit later, and maybe it's better that she doesn't begin her existence in the first place. Not to mention the toll that it would take on me, my wife, my family, etc. And that we can actually do something that is dreadful, but out of an intention of love. And so I'm not here to say that what we did was the right thing for everybody, but it felt like the right thing for us to do in this situation. And I should just also make a small parenthesis that this was during the 2016 presidential campaign. And, you know, we have Donald Trump going out and basically offending all sorts of different groups and minorities, disabled people, Mexicans, African Americans, etc. And, you know, I'm like a well-off white guy, and I thought, okay, it's not possible for him really to offend me. Like, I'm his core constituency in the United States. And then it just so happened that during this week of decision-making, he made a comment about abortion, and he said, women who have abortions should be punished. I'm like, good job, you did it. You just succeeded in offending me there, because I really just wanted to shout at the TV, do you have like any effing idea what people are going through in a situation like this, where you might have to make such a decision, you know? And you're suggesting that if somebody would intervene in their pregnancy for this particular reason, that then, you know, they should go to prison afterwards? Like, doesn't he understand that losing your child is punishment enough? Doesn't he understand that nobody undertakes this decision without great sadness in their heart? Anything that the state would add would be just gratuitous. So I tried to put that aside, and my wife and I walked into Saint Justine, and we told them that we were there to interrupt the pregnancy. And she went through a process where they induced the labor, and after about 36 hours or so, it was complete. We named our daughter Dakini Rosanna, and I'm also writing a book about this, which explains the origin of that in more detail. When I saw Dakini Rosanna, I couldn't help but smile. After these weeks of turmoil, here she was. She was so perfectly formed, just small. We joked that she was beautiful like her mother and bald like her father. I felt like I was stepping into a cold lake. At first, each movement forward stung, but after a minute or two, I got used to it and took another step in. The horror I anticipated never arose. Instead, I was enraptured as I looked down on her delicate features. The next step in the water would be to touch her, and again, I approached with trepidation. I stood at the side of the bed for several minutes, wondering how much deeper I would go. Then, without reflection, I simply reached down and placed my hand on her, which nearly covered her entire body. Eyes shut, her miniature limbs flinched when I touched her feet. I felt her taking tiny breaths like sips of water, and whispered in her ear that she was surrounded by people who loved her. We stood there in silent vigil as the doctors scurried about to complete their postpartum procedures and paperwork. After the initial rush, they left us in peace. Every 15 minutes or so, they would come back in to see if Dakini Rosanna's heart was still beating. After 2 hours or so, her breaths became less and less frequent, and the next time the nurse came in, she confirmed that she was gone. They wheeled us into another room and told us we could take all the time we wanted with her. After a few hours had passed, the time had come to pass her back to the medical team, and they told us they would weigh her and give us a kit that would include pictures and her footprints. We kept postponing the moment, wanting to hang on just a little longer. And when we knew that we couldn't, I went over to put my hands on them, knowing full well that this would be the last time the three of us would be together. Dakini Rosanna had died a few hours before, and by this time the side of her body that had not been in contact with my wife had grown cold and stiff. Because she had been covered with fluid when the doctors placed her on my wife's chest, when we went to lift her off, Dakini Rosanna's body left a little imprint on her. It was a sort of farewell tattoo. Like the imprint left in a snow angel, we saw the outline of her head, ear, neck, and leg. But the most striking feature was the outline of her fist, which was clenched and upheld like a revolutionary. She made sure to leave us a message behind. So needless to say, this was absolutely devastating for both of us. I came back into work, I did my job as best I could, and I began to understand what people go through when they undergo loss and how the process of grief works. And one thing that I think is a commonality in grief, and by the way, I should just put a parenthesis to say that when we asked the doctors how frequently our experience happened at Saint Justine, they told us 3 times a week. 3 times every week there's people who go into Saint Justine with the same types of issues that we had and go through the same experience. These are people you may pass by on the metro or on your bike ride home. Multiply that out by all of Quebec and all of Canada and all of the United States, and maybe you begin to have a sense of what the Buddha was trying to convey with the mustard seed story. One thing about grief is that it's a land that all of us visit, but none of us want to linger there. It's a place where when you go, you want to get out as soon as you can because you're overwhelmed, physically, mentally, emotionally. You look for ways to escape from it. And I know I certainly did. I looked for ways not to be there. And me being the intellectual person that I am, I escaped through my mind. And I began to weave a narrative of explanation for why this had happened. This is a very common reaction to loss, is that we want to understand why. We want to make sense of it. And there's a parallel in the biblical tradition with the story of Job. And Job has all sorts of terrible things happen to him, even though he's a righteous person. And all of his friends are trying to come and explain why this happened to him. And none of the explanations hold water. And I would kind of come to see that very quickly about how any way that we explain the tragedies in our life, it might make us feel better for a time, but at the end of the day, I don't really think we can understand why. So for me, I had a meditation practice that involved this funny-sounding name, Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century. And I was really drawn to Padmasambhava because I knew that he had an approach of teaching called crazy wisdom. And crazy wisdom is when a teacher teaches in unconventional, surprising, unexpected, outrageous ways in order to wake the student up. So there's a great story actually of in the lineage of Padmasambhava. Somebody became enlightened, Naropa became enlightened when his teacher Tilopa slapped him on the face with a sandal. That was his moment of awakening. And then there are other stories of Milarepa being forced by his teacher to build up a tower 7 stories high, only to take it down and build it up in another place, and then do that again and again and again, a little bit like Sisyphus. And I really resonated with this approach because it could mean that there would be a teaching imparted in even the seemingly most crazy, far out there situations. So I began to tell myself a story that, well, maybe this situation with Dakini Rosanna came about from my interaction, my calling upon the energies of Padmasambhava. And I guess I didn't really heed the fact that there were warnings around doing these practices because you have to be sufficiently prepared before you undertake them because who knows what's going to happen to you. You might not be able to handle it. But for me, that became part of my story, that this had happened because I had maybe somehow offended these energies in one way or another, which sounds completely crazy right now, but I preferred to have some explanation than none at all. It was more comforting to tell myself this story, even though it was a massive case of projecting, thinking that somehow there was this mysterious, metaphysical, ethereal entity that had come down into my life. I preferred that than sitting with my pain. And around the same time, I also dealt with my pain by trying to numb myself. And I didn't realize this at the time. It's only clear in retrospect. We human beings seem to have an infinite number of ways that we can delude ourselves. And we tell ourselves that we're doing one thing for one reason, but actually our reasons are hidden. And for me, in the summer after this happened, I just started getting stoned every day. And I didn't really know why at the time. I told myself, as many pot smokers do, that it's to be creative or that's to get in touch with myself. But, with the legalization coming up here next month, I really think that you have to approach that substance with a lot of caution. The chances of you deceiving yourself and you telling yourself you're doing it for one reason, but actually it's something else, are very high with that. And, it snuck up on me little by little, and I only understood later that I was trying to anesthetize myself. In just the same way that those people that we see on Maisonneuve and Atwater, who are often drunk, they're in pain. This is self-medication. What if we could approach them that way? Or what if we could approach somebody who's obviously trying to deal with something through substances with the understanding that this person is really somebody who's in pain and doesn't know how else to deal with it? So I went along that road, I intellectualized, I escaped, I wasn't there in the Abrahamic sense. And then something else happened. It's like I was asleep at the wheel, and all of a sudden I hit a lamppost, and I had to reevaluate how I was dealing with this. So after Dakini Rosanna was born, my wife and I wanted to move on as quickly as possible. We wanted to put this behind us. We wanted to get pregnant and have another child very soon, which I suppose in some way was a way of trying to also not deal with some of these difficult emotions that were arising. So she became pregnant, and after 7 weeks, there was a miscarriage. So here we were all elated that somehow the story was going to have like a happy ending, that I would narrate the pain of Dakini Rosanna as saying, oh yeah, but don't worry, that was just a prelude to something more wonderful that was going to happen later on. And now it's like, that went out the window. And there were all sorts of other strange things that were happening to me at the same time, where I got out of the blue a bill from Revenue Quebec that said I owed them $800. When we were on vacation, a porcupine chewed through our transmission line, and we were like way out in the bush and had to get it like towed 30 kilometers, and then the car broke down 2 other times after that. And then we got a call from a daycare right next to us that said that our son could go there, and then when we got back, they rescinded their invitation. And so it was like, I was really feeling like I had a cloud hanging over me at this time. And I was like, okay, I don't know what's going on. There's a lot of stuff happening, but I can't work through it in the way that I did before. So I resolved, I'm not gonna smoke anymore. I'm gonna stay with my emotions, and I'm gonna see what happens there. And what happened was that I went into that pit of pain in my heart. And it would come up on me at the same time every day, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would begin to kind of know it after a couple of weeks. I would say, oh no, here's that black hole of sadness that's coming again. Do something, get distracted. And then I would say, no, don't get distracted. Go into it. Very uncomfortable, very difficult. And I was at my wit's end. I all of my traditional tools for how to work through things, gone. Nothing made sense anymore. I was completely groundless. And, in retrospect, that was a great blessing because it made me open to whatever life was going to put in my path. So, you can be brought to openness through the fact that there's no other place to go. And there's a woman who I met. And by the way, I have the hero's journey over here. I won't go into that, but if any of you have studied Joseph Campbell, then this whole trajectory that I'm about to describe actually mirrors the hero's journey. And you can also see that in The Matrix and Star Wars and Harry Potter, the Iliad, the Odyssey. Basically all great stories that we read follow this pattern. And one of the elements in the hero's journey is finding a helper or a mentor and receiving a substance or a special tool that will help the path continue. And so I met this woman who I lovingly joke probably would have been burnt at the stake 300 years ago because she was like a witch. She knew all about herbs, and she was a midwife and homeopathy, all this stuff. And I went and I talked to her about what was going on. And she said, I know what you need. It's called Ignatia. It's a homeopathy treatment. It's a poison, actually. And she said, take 1 pill 1 time and see what happens. And I was like, yeah, right. Homeopathy? Like, that doesn't work. Like, it's just a sugar pill. It's just a placebo. But because I was desperate, I had nothing else to go on. So I'm sitting here in my office at Dawson one afternoon, and I remembered that I had these pills in my pocket, and I popped it. And I was like, okay, let's see what happens. And I'm riding my bike home. And 20 minutes later, I'm going up the hill on Avenue du Parc, and all of a sudden, I feel this rush of inspiration. Like fully formed sentences just popping into my head like that, one after another after another. So like I biked home as quickly as I could, and like I was probably pushing a lot of people out of the way, but I had to get home. I had to get to my computer and let some of this out. And I opened up the computer, and for 2 hours, I sat there and my fingers were going nonstop. 6 pages, single space of writing, just like that, as though channeled from something beyond my mind. And the same thing happened the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and at some point it began to calm down. And I went back and I thought, okay, maybe this is part of my healing process, what just happened here. And I started studying what I had written. I started being a little bit critical towards what I had been putting out there on the page and trying to analyze, are there any patterns that are coming back that I can see? And I began to notice 2 things. I began to notice patterns actually that had been defining me for decades, but that I hadn't really been consciously aware of. The first one was victimhood, and the second one was stoicism, or at least the popular understanding of stoicism. I began to notice in my writing just how often I was writing things like, I don't deserve that this happened to me. I'm a good person. I didn't do anything wrong. The world is out to get me. There's that dark cloud that hovered over me. It's not right. Other people who do way worse things, they get away with their deeds. Look at poor little me, a victim of unfortunate circumstances. I could see that on the page. Interesting. I could also see how my intellectualization was a way of going out of my feelings and seeking to numb myself from feeling things by thinking my way out of it, either through Padmasambhava, or I did a lot of writing on Carl Jung and things like that. But that was not actually allowing me to feel what was happening there. So with my critical mindset, I was able to spot those patterns at work. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. That's at least some valuable knowledge. That's some poison that I had been taking my whole life, because I could see how these patterns were at work in the past. And now I'm aware of it. Maybe I can transform this into something medicinal. I also noticed along those lines that I was being very megalomaniac and thinking that it's, my fault that all of this happened, that it's my responsibility. And when I was critical about that, then I realized that this doesn't make sense at all, because, who do I think I am? Do I think I'm really powerful enough to invoke some metaphysical energies and have it manifest in this particular way? Like, what about the other person in the story? What about my wife in all of this? Am I so powerful that I can cause things to happen in her body? What about her mindset? It just began to unravel the whole narrative of suffering that I had built up around. And so I thought, okay, now it feels like maybe I'm moving forward. This is the first step of the healing journey. And I started going into this more. And after a few months, I was stuck again. And I again became critical about what approach I was taking and what I was hoping to get out of that writing. And I had to admit to myself, again, deluding myself when I was writing this, I didn't realize at the time that when I was deciphering these patterns of victimhood and stoicism and responsibility and all this stuff, I was doing so with quite a hostile attitude, in thinking like, okay, now that I've seen these things, like, I'm free from them. I don't have to let them define me anymore. And this brought me to understand actually something that I think is quite pervasive in our culture when it comes to grief, is that you may have seen like TED Talks or books with titles like How Cancer Made Me a Better Person, or Why Losing My Husband Was the Best Thing That Could Have Happened to Me. And these are great stories that people tell. And I don't criticize people who want to process their journey like that. But what I was trying to do is I was trying to do something similar there. And I was trying to treat my grief instrumentally. I was trying to get something out of it. I was trying to somehow justify all of the pain and the confusion by being able to figure it out afterwards. I was wanting to be efficient in my grief. And if I wasn't, then somehow that would be an affront to the children we lost. So talk about putting pressure on myself, right? If I didn't go through this work, then these losses would be in vain. So I was stuck with that for some time until I rediscovered a tool that I've shared in my class many times that I think is really at the heart of critical thinking and what you need to be a critical thinker. And that's what in Zen Buddhism is called the beginner's mind. So somebody like Socrates had beginner's mind because he questioned things that other people took for granted. He didn't assume that he knew anything about anything. And he just investigated with the curiosity of a 6-year-old child who has not been conditioned and told what to believe about society and phenomena. There's also a Zen saying called not always so. So if you approach critical thinking with that attitude, then you're going to be much more successful. because it opens you up to possibilities that you didn't realize were there. And so when I began to re-adopt this attitude of beginner's mind, I began to see through conceptual distinctions and categories that I had unconsciously been making here. And one of those was the idea that these events that happened were some form of punishment. I was telling myself that story, I was suffering from that story, but then in the space of beginner's mind, I was critical and I was saying, is that really the case? Am I really being punished here? How can I be sure? I have no idea. Maybe it's a punishment, but maybe it's also not a punishment. Like, it could be either one, so why am I assuming that it's a punishment? So that began to kind of melt away the fog of thinking that this was somehow a punishment. And then I began to look back at victimhood too. And I began to say, well, wait a minute, why was I trying to get rid of victimhood? Why was I trying to think that now I'm a better person because I've seen through this and I don't have to be a victim anymore? Actually, if I look back at the times in the past when I thought I was a victim, there were actually many positive things that happened as a result. It may have been a completely mistaken perception that the world was out to get me, but it caused me to work a lot harder because I wanted to bend the world to my will, basically. But I look back at the work that I did in university and the work that I did in relationships, and especially when I was younger, if things didn't go my way, again, I adopted the victim hat, but then I became a better person as a result. So in some way, I owed a debt of gratitude to victimhood. Maybe without adopting that attitude, then I wouldn't be in the place where I am right now. So was victimhood a bad thing or a good thing then? Well, it's kind of both. Maybe there's not a conceptual distinction between the two. And so I began to do this with pattern after pattern after pattern, and beautiful things emerged. So I investigated suffering. I asked myself, why did I want to run away from suffering? Why did I sedate myself? Why did I want to check out from the pain? What was I running from? Why was I afraid of it? And actually, if I sat with beginner's mind with suffering, I realized it too. I owe a great debt of gratitude. If not for suffering, then I wouldn't have even been put on the path of meditation in the first place, which has brought me innumerable blessings. And this goes back actually to the historical Buddha and his journey, that the Buddha, before he was a Buddha, was a spoiled prince. He was living in a pleasure palace. And it was only his encounters with the realities of sickness, old age, and death that catalyzed his journey to enlightenment. And I see this again and again. People get interested in meditation or yoga, or they take up a spiritual practice because they're in pain and because they want to know how to relate to their suffering in a more constructive way. So suffering can be very valuable too in that respect. There's a lot of wisdom to be gained from suffering. So where do I put the line between suffering and wisdom? Not only that, when you suffer, it opens your heart to compassion. You can't have compassion without suffering first. So when I encounter others who have lost their children, or like miscarriage, for example, miscarriage is way more common than the medical intervention that we went through with Dakini Brozana. It's estimated that at least one in every 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. And yet it's a very taboo subject. It's very difficult to bring up. People respond very awkwardly many times when you talk about miscarriage. They might say some things like, oh, well, you can just have another one. It's like, I heard that. And now, having gone through that process, I know that what other people need in grief is not advice. It's presence. It's being able to be there with them, to hold their hand, to say, yeah, I know this is really difficult. I don't know why. I don't know when it's going to end for you, but I'm here for you. That was the best thing that somebody could do for me. And now, after having undergone this, I know how to do it, and I know how to extend that compassion to others. So thank you, suffering, for that. And what of death? What if I adopt my beginner's mind and start to meditate on death a little bit? what do we know about death? It's the greatest unknown. And I think because it's the greatest unknown, it provokes the greatest amount of fear in us. And in our culture, when we're afraid, we redouble our efforts to try to control it. Go to a hospital where you have an 85-year-old person who's suffering from 3 terminal diseases and see how they're hooked up to all sorts of machines and tubes. Because we're afraid. We don't want to let go. We want to somehow cure the illness of death. And being part of this culture, I have naturally absorbed this fear and this repulsion towards death, and this assumption that death is a terrible thing. And so if I assume that death is a terrible thing, then what happened to Dakini Rosanna and the miscarriage we named he, she, petit bonheur, because we didn't know whether it was a boy or a girl? If I think that death is a terrible thing, then what happened to them is an unspeakable tragedy. But if I admit that I don't know what death is and what happened to them, where they went afterwards, then that opens my heart a little bit more. I'm not saying that they're in a better place. I'm not saying that what happened to them is for the best. I'm just saying that I don't know. And I can see that if I assume that death is a terrible thing, then it brings me sadness and suffering. If I open my heart to not knowing, then there are many things that are possible there. And if I keep going with death a little bit more, and I really try to see the value of death, well, we don't realize actually that life and death form part of one interconnected whole. They're 2 sides of the same coin, just like suffering and wisdom. You're sitting here right now, alive, because you have ingested the dead bodies of plants and animals. And even if you're vegan, you're still responsible for thousands of deaths of insects and worms and all the other things that it took to grow your food. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. The universe is one giant snake gobbling itself up. And life and death are co-constitute one another. There's that. There's the fact that your ancestors who went before you, who are now not present, opened up worlds of possibility for you. You owe your existence to their death as well. And if you think about it on a biological sense, every organ in your body is shaped by countless generations of death. The process of natural selection produces new forms only through death. So when you go out and see a flower, you don't see the thousands of flowers that came before that were just a little bit less colored or a little bit shaped, that those flowers didn't survive and reproduce as well as the flower that eventually did. And the same thing is true for every cell in your body. So we, in the realm of the living, have a very direct kinship with the death of every being that has come before us, who is our ancestor. And now, maybe this is about as happy of an ending as we can work towards. We now have a new baby who's 11 months old, Joachim. Look at that little guy. And of course, he's the light of our lives, and we're so delighted that he's here, and he has all these little personality already that you can see, and he's very different from his brother, and he's just overjoyed to be alive, like all babies are. And, he wouldn't exist. He exists because they don't. And I'm so in love with him, just the way he is, his personality, his little quirks, his body, all that stuff, right? But that wouldn't be in that form if not for these 2 losses before. And so I feel like when I'm extending my love to him, I'm also in some way extending my love to them as well. That they are not irretrievably gone. but they are unavoidably present. And so when I hold him, that line between life and death, that conceptual distinction that began to break down with analyzing food and ancestors, it just completely gets washed away. One final conceptual distinction that has been broken down in this process, is the distinction between me and others. So my class is called Know Thyself, and we talk about the question of who I am. There's a beautiful saying in the Ubuntu philosophy in South Africa, I am because you are. And when I was reflecting on this whole process, I realized that I didn't do it as an isolated individual. I did it because I had the support and the love of people around me in my community. From my colleagues here at work, to my family around me in Colorado, my wife's family, my friends. I wouldn't be able to be here and speak about this if not for them. So you see Daniel here, but what you don't see is the whole host of supporting characters that allowed me to be here right now. And that is true of all of us. We don't exist in isolation. We are because of others. And so when you begin to see how your identity is intimately interwoven with that of others, you see the mystical truth that we are all really connected and that we all really are one. And in the book, I talk about the experience of the disciples on the road to Emmaus after Jesus was crucified, and how they find that wisdom in community and in simple objects, breaking bread. Rilke. Let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. So let me find my notes. Yes, I have seen that life can be often arbitrary and cruel, and I don't want to turn away from that or sugarcoat it with naive cliches. This process has showed me, however, that I can relate to this reality in such a way and not become entirely consumed by it. I can still see the horror in the fact that everything eats everything else. I can still cry at the injustice when dreadful things happen to good people. I can still recoil when death inevitably comes to consume everything I hold dear. But my perspective can widen to affirm that these grim realities somehow, in ways perhaps I cannot understand, have their place. Setting aside the little voice in my head that says, I would like things to be otherwise, I can affirm, as God does in Genesis, that this existence and everything in it is fundamentally good. Or at least that's what I'm striving to do. Would I be able to make such a proclamation if confronted with an even greater tragedy? I don't know. But I do know that there is something beneficial, perhaps even noble, about the aspiration to embody this attitude. Compared to the alternative narrative of how rotten the world is, a story that certainly wouldn't lack for supporting points. Affirming that every life experience is valuable just as it is will bring out more inspiration and potential in myself and others. And if I have the choice between two interpretive frameworks, why not choose the one that will be more life-giving? Why not choose a vision that will help bring out more love? If I embrace every situation as an opportunity to develop greater levels of insight, then I am empowered to creatively respond to whatever comes my way. Painful though they may be, every experience can be a stepping stone to awakening ever greater awareness and compassion. Seeing everything this way would be an incredible incentive to stay, in the Abrahamic sense, with every experience just as it is. In this way, after cutting through layer after layer of beliefs and conditioned identities, all that is left is a heart open to every experience, no matter how pleasant or unpleasant, along with an acute awareness of the unfathomable mystery that underlies it all.